The Viking Age is often remembered for roaring feasts, overflowing mead horns, and warriors boasting of their victories. But for most Viking families, the truth was far harsher. Survival in the frozen north meant enduring long winters, failed harvests, and empty storerooms. Their meals were not feasts of glory, but bowls of thin gruel, dried fish, and flatbreads baked in ashes. Behind the legend of conquest was the daily fight against hunger. Today we reveal the cheap meals Viking people ate to stay alive. To imagine the Viking world, forget shiny helmets and neatly polished swords. Picture wind-lashed fjords, endless forests, and the constant gnaw of hunger. The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were survivors, navigating a brutal landscape where every meal counted. Their diets were shaped by necessity, not luxury. Every bite had to fuel long hours of rowing, chopping wood, hunting, and, of course, pillaging. Eating wasn't a pleasure, it was strategy. The backbone of the Viking diet was simplicity itself. Cheap, storable foods that could endure the bitter northern winters. Barley, oats, and rye weren't glamorous, but they were indispensable. They were ground into coarse flour for flatbreads or boiled into porridge thick enough to stand a wooden spoon upright. A Viking's morning often began with a steaming bowl of oatmeal or barley gruel, fortified with a handful of foraged berries if they were lucky. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't refined, but it was energy-dense, warm, and filling. Vegetables weren't the side dish, they were survival tools. Turnips, carrots, onions, and cabbage grew in humble plots near their longhouses. Root vegetables could be stored in cellars, buried under straw, hidden from frost, feeding families for months when fresh food vanished. Every meal was a careful balance between what could be grown, gathered, or caught. And caught was the key word. Fish, from icy rivers or the roaring sea, became a staple. Vikings smoked, salted, and dried it, stretching a single haul across days, weeks, or even months. Meat was rarer, but no less vital. Sheep, pigs, goats, and the occasional cow were butchered sparingly. Anything that could not be eaten immediately was salted or dried, ensuring that even the lowliest thrall could grab a piece during harsh winters. Dairy, too, provided essential sustenance. Milk, cheese, and the thick, yogurt-like skyr were inexpensive and storable, delivering protein and fat with every bite. Eggs from chickens or geese were another cheap, high-energy staple, often boiled or scrambled over open fires in tiny iron pans. Even seasoning followed the same rule of economy. Herbs grew wild, berries were foraged, and fermented fish, stinky but potent, transformed bland porridge or bread into something palatable. Honey, when available, was treasured, sweetening porridge or lending a sharp bite to preserved meat. For Vikings, flavour was less about refinement and more about survival. The stronger the taste, the more likely it would mask the faint decay of poorly stored food. Eating wasn't just about hunger, it was about readiness. Every mouthful had to prepare them for the next raid, the next battle, or the grueling work of winter. Survival meant knowing which foods could sustain energy, which could endure travel, and which could make a meal feel like more than mere sustenance. The daily diet of the average Viking was humble, repetitive, and fiercely practical, but it was the foundation of everything: strength, endurance, and the sheer stubbornness that allowed the Norse to dominate land, sea, and myth. In the harsh world of fjords and forests, Viking meals were a quiet kind of heroism. Each bite was a strategy, each preserved loaf a lifeline, and each morsel a reminder that survival was a war waged one meal at a time. To understand a Viking, you must first understand what and how they ate. Long before a Viking set sail in a longship or sharpened an axe for a raid, they scavenged the land like predators in a relentless hunt for survival. The forests, fields, and frozen riverbanks were not just landscapes, they were pantries, stocked with food for the clever, the bold, and the desperate. Every berry bush, every moss-covered rock, every clump of wild herbs held the promise of nourishment or the risk of poison. Berries were more than a treat. They were critical sources of vitamins that kept scurvy and winter illness at bay. Lingonberries, bilberries, cloudberries, and wild strawberries were gathered in bulk during the fleeting summer months. Foraging was a strategic operation. Families, often including children, would trek miles through thorny underbrush, careful not to waste a single edible find. Berries were eaten fresh when possible, dried in the sun for winter, or boiled into thick, sour jams that could be smeared on coarse bread. Mushrooms were a gamble. Some were delicacies, others deadly. Viking knowledge of fungi was extensive, honed over generations. Picking the wrong cap could be fatal, but a well-chosen mushroom could transform an otherwise bland stew into a feast. Every meal was a calculated risk, a lesson in patience, observation, and instinct. Roots and tubers were the backbone of foraged nutrition. Carrots, turnips, and parsnips were dug from the earth, sometimes in frozen soil, using sharp sticks or crude spades. These were eaten raw in a pinch, roasted over fire, or boiled into thick, sustaining broths. The Vikings understood the value of every calorie they preserved, fermented, and stored roots in cellars to endure months of famine and frost. Wild herbs were essential for flavour, medicine, and sometimes disguise. Thyme, sage, nettle, and wild garlic grew abundantly. Vikings not only sprinkled them into porridge or meat stews, but also relied on them to treat ailments, preserve meat, or mask the taste of questionable fish and game. Each leaf and stem could mean the difference between a meal that fueled strength and one that induced illness. The rivers and lakes were another critical source of survival. Fish, often salted or smoked, were caught with nets, traps, or simple spears. Eels, salmon, trout, and perch were abundant, providing protein and fat necessary for long days of labour and battle. Seaweed was not overlooked either. Packed with nutrients, it could be added to stews or eaten dried when other food was scarce. Even insects were not off the table. In extreme hunger, Vikings would consume larvae or beetles, a last resort protein that many modern readers would recoil at. But in their world, every edible source mattered. Foraging wasn't mere survival, it was a daily education. A Viking learned which plants thrived in which season, which berries were safe after the first frost, and which roots could survive the harshest winters. Knowledge was power, and power meant life. By mastering the wild pantry, Vikings could survive when crops failed, when raids yielded nothing, or when storms trapped them in the unforgiving north. Every morsel of wild food was a victory over hunger, every foraged meal a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. In the cold, wind-swept lands of Scandinavia, the ability to recognize a berry, dig a root, or catch a fish could spell the difference between life and death. For the Vikings, mornings weren't gentle awakenings with warm cups of coffee. They were a race against hunger, fatigue, and the bitter cold. Grain was the backbone of the Viking diet, a staple that could keep them alive during long winters when the forests were silent and the seas unforgiving. Barley, oats, rye, and sometimes wheat were ground into coarse flour or cracked into groats, forming the base of every meal from breakfast to dinner. Porridge was the most common and versatile preparation. Thick, hearty, and filling, it could be cooked over a fire in a simple iron pot or in the hearth of a modest home. Vikings ate it plain when resources were tight, or enriched it with milk, honey, or bits of dried fish and meat when available. The texture was never delicate, it was dense and chewy, a meal meant to sustain muscles through a day of rowing, chopping wood, or carrying heavy loads. One spoonful was enough to push a tired warrior to the next task, one bite enough to silence the gnawing pangs of hunger. Bread, another grain-based staple, was far from the fluffy loaves we know today. Viking bread was dense, often flat, and baked on stones or in simple clay ovens. It could be stored for weeks, surviving the damp, cold climate where fresh produce often rotted within days. Coarse barley or rye flour made it gritty, yet satisfying. Sometimes, bread was mixed with milk, eggs, or leftover fish, turning it into a rudimentary yet energy-packed meal. For travelling Vikings, bread was indispensable. It was portable, durable, and a reliable source of calories. Grain was also transformed into ale, a staple in every Viking household. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was nutrition, hydration, and morale all in one. Made from barley, sometimes flavoured with herbs, it contained enough calories to supplement or replace a meal. Drinking ale was a survival strategy, the weak, thin beer for everyday sustenance, the stronger, more potent brew for festivals or long journeys. Even children drank ale, diluted with water, to stave off malnutrition during harsh seasons. The preparation of grain-based foods demanded skill and time. Grinding barley or oats required hours of work at a quern or hand mill. Every scrap of flour was precious. Overcooked or scorched porridge could mean waste, and waste meant hunger. Vikings were resourceful. Leftover porridge could be dried, pounded, and stored as emergency rations, ready to be rehydrated on short notice. Bread crusts were saved to thicken soups or ground into crumbs for fish dishes. Nothing was discarded. Survival depended on maximising every ounce of sustenance. Porridge and bread weren't just cheap, they were egalitarian. Kings and thralls alike relied on grain in some form. What differentiated the elite from the poor was the addition of luxury ingredients, dried fruits, honey, or rich dairy. But the core, life-sustaining porridge and dense bread, was universal. Its simplicity masked its power. A well-prepared grain meal could fuel a warrior for days, keep families alive through famine, and provide the energy necessary for the relentless pace of Viking life. In a world without supermarkets or refrigerators, grains were the lifeline. They carried Vikings through winter storms, raids, and endless days on unforgiving seas. A spoonful of porridge was more than food, it was survival, endurance, and resilience distilled into a humble, steaming bowl. While meat and fish were the prized foods of the Viking table, the backbone of their survival came from the unassuming plants that grew in the wild or in carefully tended gardens. For the average Viking, vegetables weren't a side dish, they were a matter of life and death. Roots, leaves, and shoots provided essential nutrients during harsh winters when hunting failed and the sea offered little bounty. The Vikings were master foragers. Forests, meadows, and riverbanks were their pantries. Nettles, dandelion greens, and wild onions were common finds, often boiled or added to stews to enhance flavour and sustain strength. Berries like bilberries, lingonberries, and wild strawberries provided vitamins and antioxidants, eaten raw when ripe or preserved in honey or brine for later consumption. The smell of a simmering vegetable broth in a Viking household was not just comforting, it was the aroma of survival. In settled communities, Viking gardens were practical, not ornamental. Carrots, turnips, leeks, cabbage, and onions were grown in small plots, carefully rotated to maintain the soil. During long winters, these root vegetables became essential food stores. Turnips and cabbages were hardy, keeping for months in cool cellars or pits lined with straw. Carrots and leeks were valued for both flavour and nutrition, sliced into stews or roasted over fires to release their natural sweetness. These humble vegetables provided the fibre and vitamins that prevented scurvy and starvation alike. Greens were often dried or fermented. Sauerkraut-like cabbage preparations allowed Vikings to preserve food for months, giving them access to nutrients long after the harvest. Leaves and shoots, even if bitter or tough, were boiled into nourishing broths that stretched scarce meat and fish into multiple meals. A single pot of vegetable stew could feed an entire family for a day, and sometimes a week, if rationed carefully. Vikings also understood the power of mushrooms, herbs, and wild garlic. Mushrooms were foraged from damp forests, sometimes used fresh, other times dried. Wild garlic and chervil were crushed into sauces, mixed with grains, or added to soups, giving flavour to otherwise monotonous meals. Herbs were more than seasoning. They were medicine, used to heal minor ailments and prevent spoilage. The Viking diet was intensely practical. Flavour, nutrition, and survival intertwined in every leafy bite. Vegetables weren't glamorous, and they weren't meant to be. To a Viking, a bowl of greens was sustenance, a shield against hunger. Unlike roasted boar or freshly caught fish, which were rare and celebratory, these cheap, readily available plants were the foundation of daily life. They kept warriors strong enough to row longships, farmers vigorous enough to till frozen soil, and children alive through unforgiving winters. Foraged greens and garden vegetables shaped the Viking palate. Their flavours, earthy, bitter, sweet, formed the background of countless meals, enhancing whatever protein or grains were available. They also carried symbolism. The resilience of a root vegetable mirrored the resilience required to survive the harsh Scandinavian world. Each boiled leaf and roasted root was a small triumph over hunger, disease, and the raw forces of nature. In essence, while meat and fish brought excitement to the Viking table, it was vegetables, the overlooked, inexpensive, and infinitely adaptable greens that kept the people alive. Without them, the longships would have been empty, the raiders weak, and the sagas of Viking endurance never written. Vegetables weren't just cheap food. They were survival, strategy, and sustenance rolled into humble, earthy bites. For the Vikings, the sea was not just a highway for raiding and trading. It was the ultimate pantry. Fish wasn't a delicacy, it was survival. Every fjord, river, and coastline offered a potential meal, and the Vikings learned to exploit these watery resources with astonishing efficiency. From the salty waves of the North Sea to inland rivers, fish was abundant, cheap, and versatile, perfect for feeding communities through lean winters and long voyages. Cod, herring, salmon, and eel dominated the Viking diet, each prepared in ways designed to maximize longevity and nutrition. Salted and dried fish was a cornerstone. Salted cod, known as stockfish, could last for months, even years, making it ideal for long sea journeys or for storage through harsh winters. Herring, abundant in the colder waters, was often pickled in brine or fermented into a pungent, tangy delicacy. These methods weren't just culinary, they were survival techniques. Fresh fish could spoil in hours. Salt and fermentation transformed it into a reliable, protein-rich staple. Smoked fish was another critical preparation. Vikings built smokehouses near rivers or along the coast, slowly curing their catch over wood fires. The smoke added flavour, deterred spoilage, and allowed fish to be transported to inland villages far from the sea. Even on the move, Vikings could carry small smoked fish as a portable meal, a compact energy source, while travelling or raiding. Fishing itself was a skill passed down through generations. Men and women of all ages participated, using nets, traps, spears, and hooks. Rivers were dotted with weirs and traps, designed to funnel fish into easy reaches for harvest. Longships and small boats doubled as mobile fishers' platforms. A successful day's catch could feed a village or provide trade goods to barter for grains, cheese, or other necessities. Vikings also understood the value of organ meats and smaller fish parts. Heads, guts, and bones were boiled into broths that stretched limited resources, infusing soups with flavour and essential nutrients. Nothing was wasted. In a world where survival depended on efficiency, every piece of the catch counted. Fish was often paired with grains, legumes, or vegetables to create hearty stews that fueled labourers, warriors, and children alike. Beyond nutrition, fish shaped Viking culture and exploration. Coastal and riverine settlements grew around rich fishing grounds, and mastery of maritime skills allowed Vikings to raid, trade, and colonize far beyond Scandinavia. Fish wasn't just food, it was wealth, mobility, and a lifeline linking every Viking to the sea. For young Vikings, the taste of freshly smoked salmon or salted herring was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it was daily sustenance, extraordinary because it symbolized a connection to the vast, untamed north. Each bite carried the salt of the sea, the smoke of the fire, and the history of a people who survived and thrived in one of Europe's harshest environments. In short, fish was more than a cheap meal. It was a strategy, a survival tool, and a cultural glue that held communities together. Without the bounty of rivers and oceans, Viking society would have collapsed under starvation, and the legends of raiders and seafarers might have been forgotten before they began. Fish was their lifeblood, cheap, abundant, and indispensable. In the harsh lands of Scandinavia, where winters could last half a year and fertile soil was scarce, Vikings depended heavily on grains to survive. Barley, oats, and rye were their lifelines, cheap, hardy, and versatile. These grains weren't just eaten, they were the foundation of daily life, providing calories, energy, and the sustenance necessary for hard labour, long voyages, and brutal raids. Porridge was the ultimate Viking fast food, cooked over open fires in large cauldrons. It was simple, grains boiled in water or milk until soft, sometimes flavoured with a pinch of salt, herbs, or dried fruits. For labourers, porridge was eaten morning, noon, and night, a dense source of carbohydrates that kept stomachs full and bodies fueled. Sailors took it aboard ships because it was portable and long-lasting. Warriors carried dried grains as emergency rations during raids. Porridge was survival disguised as simplicity. Bread was another essential grain-based food. Vikings baked flatbreads, often thin and crisp, which could be stored for months without spoiling. Some were made from a mixture of barley and rye, while others incorporated wheat when available. These breads were eaten plain, dipped into broths, or wrapped around bits of meat or fish for a portable meal. Bread was more than food. It was a tool for endurance, a way to stretch limited protein sources into full meals. Grains were also transformed into ale, a staple drink among Vikings. Ale was nutritious, filling, and relatively safe to consume compared to untreated water, which could be contaminated. Brewing wasn't just a leisure activity, it was an essential part of survival. Ale provided calories, hydration, and warmth during cold nights, and it fueled the physical and social energy of Viking communities. Harvesting and processing grains demanded effort. Fields had to be cleared, sown, and tended, often under harsh weather conditions. After harvesting, grains were threshed, ground into flour, and stored in barrels to last through the winter months. The process was labour-intensive, but it ensured that every Viking household had a consistent supply of energy-dense food, critical in a land where hunting and fishing could be unpredictable. Grains were also a great equaliser. While meat and fish could be expensive or seasonal, porridge and bread were cheap, accessible to peasants and nobles alike. A labourer might eat the same porridge as a chieftain's servant, though the noble would supplement it with butter, honey, or dried fruits. The humble grain held communities together, feeding families, sustaining workers, and powering warriors for their expeditions. In addition, grains shaped Viking culture and ritual. Many feasts, offerings, and seasonal ceremonies included grain-based dishes, symbolizing prosperity and continuity. From morning porridge to festival ale, grains were everywhere, nourishing bodies and minds alike. In essence, grains were more than cheap meals, they were Viking fuel. They provided endurance, flexibility, and survival in a world where famine was always a threat. The Vikings understood that victory, exploration, and endurance began not with swords or longships, but with the humble grains that kept their bellies full and their spirits ready for the relentless challenges of northern life. When most people imagine Viking meals, they think of roasted meats and salted fish, but for the average Norse household, legumes and beans were the unsung heroes of survival. Cheap, filling, and packed with protein, lentils, peas, and broad beans formed a critical part of the Viking diet, especially for those who could not afford or access frequent meat. Beans were versatile. They could be boiled into stews, mashed into pastes, or added to soups with grains to create hearty meals that sustained families through long winters. Combined with barley or oats, legumes provided a complete protein source, which was crucial for maintaining strength for farming, shipbuilding, or raiding. Even seasoned warriors relied on these humble plants to fuel their bodies when meat was scarce. Stews were perhaps the most iconic Viking bean preparation. Large cauldrons hung over open fires, filled with water, barley, and an assortment of legumes, sometimes enhanced with herbs or bits of dried fish. The long simmering process not only made the beans digestible, but also allowed flavors to develop, creating a satisfying, calorie-dense meal that could feed an entire household. No fancy seasoning was needed. The simplicity of legumes was their brilliance. Peas, often dried to ensure longevity, were another staple. They were easy to store, resistant to spoilage, and could be rehydrated quickly for a quick meal. For sailors on long voyages, dried peas were essential rations, as they provided much-needed protein without taking up valuable space on ships. Even for villagers on land, a bowl of boiled peas with a piece of bread was enough to stave off hunger during grueling workdays. Legumes also had cultural significance. During seasonal festivals or communal gatherings, stews made from beans and lentils were shared among neighbours, symbolising cooperation and survival. In times of scarcity, legumes could be stretched to feed more mouths than meat alone ever could. They represented practicality, resilience, and the Viking instinct for survival above all else. Interestingly, legumes weren't just consumed by the poor. Even wealthy households incorporated them into meals, though often with enhancements like butter, honey, or cream. A noble's lentil stew might be flavoured with spices imported from distant lands, while a farmer's version was simpler but equally effective in keeping hunger at bay. Across classes, beans served as the backbone of Viking sustenance, demonstrating their unmatched versatility. For Vikings, the humble legume was more than food. It was armour for the body, an investment in energy and endurance. A day spent rowing a longship, chopping timber, or defending a settlement demanded every bit of strength these small seeds could provide. Without legumes and beans, the average Viking would have struggled to survive the brutal northern winters or to endure the physical demands of exploration and combat. In the Viking world, legumes were silent champions of survival. Cheap, reliable, and nourishing, they kept bodies strong, communities fed, and warriors ready. They remind us that not all heroes of history wore armour. Some came in the form of a simple protein-packed pulse. Beneath the rugged soil of Viking lands, hidden treasures grew quietly root vegetables. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions were the quiet heroes of the Norse diet, often overshadowed by the fame of salted fish or roasted meats. Yet these humble roots were vital, providing essential nutrients, calories, and a reliable food source for survival in the harsh Scandinavian climate. Root vegetables were hardy. They could endure freezing winters and short growing seasons when most crops failed. Stored in cool, dark cellars, they kept for months, ensuring that even in the dead of winter, Viking families could secure a hot meal. Turnips and parsnips were often boiled, roasted, or mashed into thick, starchy purees that stretched meat or fish rations further. Carrots, when in season, were added to stews for sweetness and colour, breaking the monotony of plain gruel. These vegetables weren't just fillers, they were survival powerhouses. Packed with vitamins, minerals, and fibre, roots kept Vikings strong, healthy, and battle-ready. A parsnip stew wasn't just sustenance, it was armor for the body, fueling long hours of shipbuilding, raiding, or tending livestock. For children and the elderly, these vegetables were crucial, providing nourishment that meat alone could not supply consistently. Root vegetables were also versatile. Boiled roots could be sliced and fried, creating crispy snacks for on-the-go warriors. They were often combined with grains, legumes, and even dried fish to form hearty, calorie-dense porridges. On feast days, roots could be roasted and glazed with honey or herbs, turning humble ingredients into celebratory dishes. Even peasants could experience a taste of festivity through clever preparation of roots. For Viking sailors, root vegetables were invaluable. Stored in barrels during long voyages, turnips, onions, and carrots could survive weeks at sea, giving sailors something fresh and nutritious to accompany dried fish and hard bread. The roots prevented scurvy, staved off hunger, and kept the crew functional and alert for the challenges of navigating treacherous northern waters. Beyond survival, roots held cultural significance. Festivals often included roasted root dishes, symbolizing abundance and community. Families shared dishes of mashed parsnips or turnip stew, reinforcing bonds and ensuring that even the humblest household could partake in seasonal celebrations. In this way, roots were not only physical sustenance, but a cornerstone of social cohesion. In short, the Viking diet relied heavily on these underground champions. While warriors might boast of their meat and fish, the quiet resilience of root vegetables often determined who survived and who didn't. They were affordable, storable, and packed with essential nutrition, a perfect companion to the more luxurious or protein-heavy items in a Viking's larder. Without roots, Viking survival would have been precarious. These unassuming vegetables bore the weight of harsh climates, long winters, and constant labour. They were the backbone of Viking sustenance, proving that sometimes the most powerful warriors of history are not the ones with swords, but the ones growing silently beneath the earth. Fish were the backbone of the Viking diet, a primary source of protein and fat that kept communities thriving along coasts, rivers, and lakes. From the icy fjords of Norway to the meandering rivers of Sweden and Denmark, waterways were a constant provider. Vikings didn't just eat fish. They relied on it, preserved it, traded it, and even used it as currency in some cases. Picture a small Viking village at dawn. The fishermen push their sturdy wooden boats into the frigid water, nets and hooks ready. Pike, salmon, herring, and cod were just some of the species that ended up on Viking tables. The catch could be grilled over an open flame, boiled into hearty stews, or dried and salted to last through harsh winters. Fish was practical, versatile, and life-sustaining. Salted and smoked fish became the ultimate survival food. Vikings understood that preserving fish was essential for journeys and lean seasons. Drying cod on wooden racks under cold winds, or smoking herring over fragrant woods, created a product that could last months without refrigeration. These preserved fish were perfect for long sea voyages or for stocking winter pantries. A handful of salted fish, soaked and boiled, could feed a hungry family for days, providing calories and nutrients vital for strength and endurance. Fish wasn't just sustenance, it was strategy. In many coastal villages, fishing was a communal activity. Families would cast nets together, share knowledge about seasonal migrations, and pass techniques down through generations. Knowing where and when to fish wasn't luck, it was survival. A poorly timed catch could mean weeks of hunger. The Vikings' intimate relationship with rivers, lakes, and oceans shaped not only their diet, but their culture, rituals, and even mythology. For the seafaring Vikings, fish was a portable, reliable food. During raids or trade expeditions, dried and salted fish supplemented hardtack and mead. It was lightweight, high in protein, and easy to cook over small fires. It sustained warriors during grueling days at sea, fueling the energy needed for rowing, combat, and survival in unforgiving environments. Without fish, long voyages would have been impossible, and entire fleets might have failed before reaching distant shores. Fish also influenced Viking trade and economy. Surplus catches were traded inland for grains, cheese, or livestock. Salted fish could fetch valuable silver or other goods in distant markets. Certain species were considered delicacies, like smoked salmon, and could elevate a simple meal into a feast for the wealthy, connecting the humble fisherman's life to the broader Viking society. Even in times of scarcity, the clever Viking could find ways to survive on fish. Bones were used for tools, oil from fatty fish fueled lamps, and heads or innards were sometimes boiled into nutritious broths. Nothing went to waste. Every part of the fish was a resource, a testament to Viking ingenuity and necessity. In essence, fish was more than food. It was survival, culture, and commerce all in one. Without rivers, lakes, and seas teeming with life, Vikings would not have endured the harsh climates of the north. Fish sustained them, empowered their raids, and shaped the very rhythm of Viking life. It was cheap, plentiful, and versatile, making it the lifeblood of their diet. For anyone trying to imagine surviving a day or a decade in Viking times, ignoring fish wasn't an option. It was the difference between strength and starvation, between thriving and perishing in the unforgiving north. Fish were the backbone of the Viking diet, a primary source of protein and fat that kept communities thriving along coasts, rivers, and lakes. From the icy fjords of Norway to the meandering rivers of Sweden and Denmark, waterways were a constant provider. Vikings didn't just eat fish. They relied on it, preserved it, traded it, and even used it as currency in some cases. Picture a small Viking village at dawn. The fishermen push their sturdy wooden boats into the frigid water, nets and hooks ready. Pike, salmon, herring, and cod were just some of the species that ended up on Viking tables. The catch could be grilled over an open flame, boiled into hearty stews, or dried and salted to last through harsh winters. Fish was practical, versatile, and life-sustaining. Salted and smoked fish became the ultimate survival food. Vikings understood that preserving fish was essential for journeys and lean seasons. Drying cod on wooden racks under cold winds, or smoking herring over fragrant woods, created a product that could last months without refrigeration. These preserved fish were perfect for long sea voyages or for stocking winter pantries. A handful of salted fish, soaked and boiled, could feed a hungry family for days, providing calories and nutrients vital for strength and endurance. Fish wasn't just sustenance, it was strategy. In many coastal villages, fishing was a communal activity. Families would cast nets together, share knowledge about seasonal migrations, and pass techniques down through generations. Knowing where and when to fish wasn't luck, it was survival. A poorly timed catch could mean weeks of hunger. The Vikings' intimate relationship with rivers, lakes, and oceans shaped not only their diet, but their culture, rituals, and even mythology. For the seafaring Vikings, fish was a portable, reliable food. During raids or trade expeditions, dried and salted fish supplemented hardtack and mead. It was lightweight, high in protein, and easy to cook over small fires. It sustained warriors during grueling days at sea, fueling the energy needed for rowing, combat, and survival in unforgiving environments. Without fish, long voyages would have been impossible, and entire fleets might have failed before reaching distant shores. Fish also influenced Viking trade and economy. Surplus catches were traded inland for grains, cheese, or livestock. Salted fish could fetch valuable silver or other goods in distant markets. Certain species were considered delicacies, like smoked salmon, and could elevate a simple meal into a feast for the wealthy, connecting the humble fisherman's life to the broader Viking society. Even in times of scarcity, the clever Viking could find ways to survive on fish. Bones were used for tools, oil from fatty fish fueled lamps, and heads or innards were sometimes boiled into nutritious broths. Nothing went to waste. Every part of the fish was a resource, a testament to Viking ingenuity and necessity. In essence, fish was more than food. It was survival, culture, and commerce all in one. Without rivers, lakes and seas teeming with life, Vikings would not have endured the harsh climates of the north. Fish sustained them, empowered their raids, and shaped the very rhythm of Viking life. It was cheap, plentiful, and versatile, making it the lifeblood of their diet. For anyone trying to imagine surviving a day or a decade in Viking times, ignoring fish wasn't an option. It was the difference between strength and starvation, between thriving and perishing in the unforgiving north. While Viking farms produced the staples of daily life, the forests, meadows, and rivers offered a hidden bounty that could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Foraged foods, berries, nuts, mushrooms, wild herbs, and edible greens were the unsung heroes of the Viking diet, a vital supplement when livestock failed, crops withered, or winter dragged on. Imagine a young Viking woman walking the edge of the forest with a woven basket, her eyes scanning the undergrowth. Red currants, blackberries, and raspberries peeked through the leaves. Hazelnuts and acorns dropped from gnarled oaks, while mushrooms sprouted in damp soil near the trees. Every step required knowledge and caution. Not all mushrooms were safe. A single mistake could be deadly. This wasn't a leisurely stroll, it was a hunt for life-sustaining nutrition. Foraged foods were more than filler, they were nutrient powerhouses. Berries offered vitamin C, protecting against scurvy during long winters. Nuts provided fats and protein, compact energy sources for long voyages or grueling days of work. Wild herbs weren't just seasoning, they had medicinal properties, helping with digestion, colds, and minor injuries. A simple meal of boiled roots and a handful of berries could rejuvenate exhausted labourers or hungry sailors alike. Vikings didn't simply stumble upon these wild treasures. They knew them intimately. Generations of knowledge, passed orally, ensured that each family could identify, harvest, and store what the land provided. Some herbs were dried and stored for months, others pickled or mixed into stews. Wild greens, such as sorrel and nettle, were often boiled into soups or mixed with grains, adding flavour, texture, and nutrients. Even mosses and lichens were not ignored in times of scarcity, showing the extreme adaptability of Viking survival. Foraged foods also played a role in ritual and celebration. During certain festivals, wild berries and nuts were collected to decorate feasts, offering both aesthetic and symbolic value. The act of gathering these ingredients strengthened the bond between Vikings and their land. It reminded them that survival was as much about respect for nature as it was about physical labour or skill in combat. At sea, foraged foods were essential. On long voyages, Vikings carried dried berries, salted nuts, and preserved herbs to supplement their preserved fish and hard bread. These wild foods provided variety, preventing the monotony of shipboard meals, and helped stave off nutritional deficiencies that could weaken the crew. A simple handful of dried rowan berries could revive sailors on a cold, foggy morning, restoring energy and morale for the challenges ahead. Foraged foods were cheap, accessible, and often free, but they demanded knowledge, effort, and timing. Mistake a poisonous mushroom for an edible one, and survival hung by a thread. Harvest too late, and the bounty would spoil. Yet for those who mastered the art, the wild Viking pantry was limitless, offering both sustenance and subtle luxury. In essence, foraged foods were a lifeline, a secret arsenal of survival. While roasted meats and barley porridge formed the backbone of Viking meals, it was the berries, nuts, herbs, and wild greens that filled the gaps, strengthened bodies, and sustained lives. To survive as a Viking, one had to know the land intimately and forage with cunning, patience, and respect. The forest wasn't just wilderness. It was a pantry, a pharmacy, and a proving ground for the clever and the daring. Beyond the cold waters and coastal fisheries, Viking survival relied heavily on the animals they raised. Cows, goats, sheep, pigs, and chickens were not merely livestock, they were lifelines. Each animal provided multiple essentials: milk, meat, eggs, wool, leather, and even labour. In an era without supermarkets, every part of an animal had purpose, and every morsel of food mattered. Imagine a Viking homestead nestled between fjords and farmland. The cows low in the morning mist, goats nibble stubborn shrubs along the fence, and chickens cluck excitedly as they scratch the earth for insects. From these humble creatures came staple foods: milk for drinking, cheese for preservation, butter for cooking, and eggs for quick filling meals. Dairy products were a critical part of the diet because they could be consumed fresh or stored. Butter could be salted or churned into hard blocks, surviving long winters or long journeys with minimal spoilage. Cheese, sometimes smoked or heavily salted, became a dense source of protein and fat, easy to transport and calorie-rich. Raising animals wasn't just about immediate food, it was about security. During harsh winters, when hunting was scarce and fishing slowed, the livestock were both pantry and investment. A well-fed cow or goat meant milk in the morning and meat in the freezer. Pigs were prized for their ability to convert kitchen scraps and foraged roots into fat and meat. Even the smaller animals, like chickens, contributed eggs regularly, providing essential nutrients that kept the Vikings strong through grueling days of farming, raiding, or rowing. Vikings were clever with how they managed their animals. They rotated pastures, fed livestock scraps, and let goats forage on otherwise unusable land. Nothing went to waste. Whey from cheese making was given to pigs, leftover grains fed chickens, and even animal bones and hides were used for tools, clothing, or trade. Every animal was a multi-purpose investment in survival, economy, and self-sufficiency. But survival required more than just raising animals. It required strategy. Milk could spoil in warm months, so fermentation into yogurt-like products or careful cooling in streams became vital techniques. Eggs were often preserved by coating in ash or burying in sand. Vikings had to balance immediate consumption with long-term storage, making sure no valuable protein or fat went to waste. Livestock also shaped Viking social structures. Wealth was measured in animals, not just gold or silver. A farmer with more cows, pigs, and chickens had higher status, more bargaining power in trade, and greater ability to feed his kin and allies. Livestock enabled a community to endure famine, trade for rare goods, and fund expeditions across distant seas. In essence, Viking livestock were far more than dinner. They were survival systems in themselves. They represented food, security, and prosperity. Anyone trying to survive a day in Viking times without understanding the value of these animals would quickly find themselves weak, hungry, and unprepared. Dairy and livestock were the quiet heroes of Viking nutrition, proving that clever farming, preservation, and resourcefulness were just as deadly a weapon as any sword or spear. If root vegetables kept Vikings alive, grains were the fuel that kept them strong, fast, and ready for the rigours of daily life and the chaos of battle. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat were the staples of the Viking pantry, cheap, plentiful, and incredibly versatile. Without grains, there would have been no thick stews, no hearty breads, no ale to wash down a long day's toil. In short, grains were the backbone of Viking endurance. Barley was the most common grain in northern Scandinavia. It thrived in poor soil and cold climates, making it perfect for Viking farms. Farmers would plant in spring, harvest in late summer, and carefully store the dried kernels for months of winter survival. Oats were equally essential, often used in porridge or flatbreads, while rye and wheat, less hardy but highly valued, were saved for special occasions or traded with neighbouring tribes. Grains were more than just nutrition. They were adaptability in action. Vikings could grind barley into coarse flour, creating dense, chewy breads or thickening hearty stews. Combined with root vegetables, salted fish, or scraps of meat, barley porridge became a powerful, energy-rich meal, capable of sustaining a farmer through the long hours of labour or a warrior before a raid. Even the leftovers weren't wasted. They could feed animals or be reused in brewing. Speaking of brewing, barley was also the cornerstone of Viking ale, a drink consumed daily by men and women alike. Ale was not merely a leisure indulgence, it was nutrition in liquid form. It provided calories, hydration, and a touch of warmth against the icy northern winds. Ale made from barley was more filling than plain water, and often safer to drink than river or well water, which could harbour disease. Every sip carried both energy and a sense of comfort, a taste of survival amidst a harsh world. Grains also played a role in Viking trade and economy. Barley and oats could be stored long-term and transported over long distances, making them valuable commodities. A surplus of grain allowed a village to barter with distant communities, exchange for salt, tools, or livestock, and ensure that even during famine years, some sustenance remained. The management of these grains, harvesting, drying, and storage, was a vital skill that separated thriving settlements from those on the brink of starvation. In addition, grains shaped Viking culture. Festivals, feasts, and rituals often centered around barley or rye, whether in the form of bread, porridge, or ale. Offerings to gods frequently included grain products, a symbol of sustenance, abundance, and community. The humble kernel thus carried significance far beyond its caloric value. It represented life, resilience, and the promise of another day. Ultimately, grains were more than cheap food. They were endurance, strategy, and survival rolled into one. For a Viking, knowing how to cultivate, prepare, and preserve grains was as important as knowing how to wield a sword. They kept warriors strong, farmers productive, and entire settlements alive in a land that could be unforgiving. Without grains, the Viking Age would have been a tale not of raids and voyages, but of hunger and defeat. Barley and oats were simple, yes, but they were the secret weapon of Viking endurance, powering men and women to thrive in one of the harshest environments in Europe. When the Vikings set sail across stormy seas, raided distant lands, or laboured in their villages, protein was critical and fish was their lifeline. Northern Scandinavia offered a bounty of rivers, lakes, and oceans, teeming with cod, herring, salmon, and other fish. But fresh fish spoiled quickly, especially during long voyages or harsh winters. So Vikings developed clever preservation techniques, drying and salting. These methods transformed ordinary fish into portable, long-lasting fuel for survival. Drying was one of the simplest yet most effective preservation strategies. Fish were gutted, cleaned, and hung on wooden racks called hedgel in the chilly northern air. Cold winds and low humidity slowly removed moisture, leaving a tough, resilient product that could last months, even years, if stored properly. This dried fish, sometimes hardened into nearly rock-like slabs, was not meant for luxury dining, but for raw sustenance. A small piece packed an incredible amount of protein, enough to sustain a warrior during grueling days of rowing, raiding, or chopping wood in the frigid north. Salting was another vital technique. Fish were layered in barrels with salt, which drew out moisture, killed bacteria, and made the fish last far longer than its fresh counterpart. Salted fish was particularly prized for its portability. Vikings could take barrels aboard longships, travelling hundreds of miles without worrying about spoilage. The combination of protein and sodium replenished energy and electrolytes for sailors battling icy waters and relentless waves. It wasn't gourmet, but it was life-saving. Salt itself was a precious commodity, often obtained from coastal evaporation pits or traded from distant lands. Its value went beyond flavour. It was the key to survival. A Viking who understood how to salt and dry fish had a significant advantage during winter months or lengthy raids, ensuring that hunger didn't sap strength or morale. Fish also shaped Viking culture and cuisine. It appeared in stews, boiled over open fires, or baked into dense, protein-rich breads. During feasts, salted fish might be softened by soaking in water or soaking in porridge, transforming it into a more palatable meal. Even scraps were reused. Bones could be ground for broth, and leftover skin or trimmings fed livestock, leaving nothing to waste. Beyond nourishment, dried and salted fish symbolized Viking ingenuity. It demonstrated their ability to harness natural resources, adapt to harsh environments, and survive where others might fail. For warriors embarking on raids, it was the equivalent of carrying a compact, nutrient-dense survival kit, reliable, portable, and life-sustaining. Ultimately, the Vikings' reliance on dried and salted fish highlights the harsh realities of their world. Life demanded preparation, resourcefulness, and an understanding that sustenance was survival. These preserved fish were not delicacies. They were tools, weapons even, fueling voyages across the North Sea and ensuring that Viking settlements could endure, grow, and strike fear into distant lands. In the frozen north, where hunger could be as deadly as any sword, the humble dried fish kept Vikings alive, strong, and ready for anything the harsh world threw at them. In the harsh, cold climate of Scandinavia, Vikings could not rely on delicate fruits or imported grains to keep their bellies full. Instead, they turned to the rugged, dependable root vegetables that thrived in northern soil: turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets. These earthy staples were more than mere side dishes. They were survival tools, packed with nutrients and calories to sustain a community through brutal winters, long voyages, and demanding labour. Root vegetables were hardy, easy to grow, and remarkably versatile. Farmers planted them in carefully tended plots near homes and villages, knowing these vegetables could survive frost that would kill other crops. Carrots and parsnips, rich in sugars and starch, provided much-needed energy, while turnips and beets offered essential vitamins and minerals. When the ground froze, Vikings used cellars or root pits, carefully layered with straw or sand, to store the vegetables, ensuring a steady supply during months when the earth was locked in ice. Preparation methods were simple yet effective. Roots could be boiled over open fires, roasted in hearths, or grated and mixed with grains for porridge. They were often combined with meat or fish, providing volume, flavour, and a slow-burning energy source. Parsnips, slightly sweet, could mask the blandness of a meagre broth, while turnips added a bitter edge that complemented salted fish or preserved meats. In times of scarcity, roots could even be eaten raw, though their tough texture and earthy taste were not for the faint of heart. Root vegetables were also portable. For Vikings embarking on raids or long voyages, they could carry small sacks of turnips or dried slices of parsnip, offering a reliable source of sustenance that could withstand the unpredictable seas and swaying longships. Unlike meat, which spoiled quickly without refrigeration, these vegetables were resilient, fueling warriors and labourers alike. Beyond their practical value, root vegetables shaped the Viking diet and culture. They were essential for everyday meals, feeding families and communities, and preventing malnutrition in an environment where fresh produce was scarce. Their versatility meant they could be turned into soups, stews, and simple breads, stretching limited resources to feed many mouths. Even in the grand feasts held during festivals, root vegetables played a critical role, balancing richer, meat-heavy dishes and ensuring no one went hungry. The reliance on these humble crops speaks volumes about Viking resilience and ingenuity. They understood the power of the land, the necessity of preparation, and the value of a reliable food source. A village with well-stored roots could survive blizzards, raids, and crop failures, while one without them risked starvation. In essence, root vegetables were the unsung heroes of Viking survival. They nourished warriors before battle, sustained families through harsh winters, and provided the backbone of a diet that could withstand the unforgiving northern climate. To the Vikings, these simple, earthy foods were not just sustenance, they were lifelines, grounding a fierce people in the reality of survival while fueling the legends they would leave behind. Among the staples of the Viking diet, barley and oats were unmatched in versatility and endurance. These grains were the backbone of everyday sustenance, feeding families, warriors, and travellers alike. In the frigid, unpredictable climate of Scandinavia, where delicate crops failed easily, barley and oats thrived, making them essential for survival. They were cheap, abundant, and packed with calories, the energy Vikings needed for rowing longships, tilling the land, and surviving brutal winters. Barley was particularly prized for its adaptability. It could be ground into flour for baking simple flatbreads, mixed with water and salt to form dense porridge, or even fermented to create ale, a staple of Viking mealtime. Ale wasn't just for pleasure, it was a critical source of hydration, safer than often contaminated water sources. Oats, equally resilient, could be boiled into hearty gruels, added to soups, or baked into rudimentary cakes for journeys. Together, barley and oats provided a slow-burning fuel that sustained the Vikings through long days of physical labour and dangerous raids. Preparation was practical and straightforward. Grains were often soaked, ground, or crushed, then cooked over open flames. Porridge could be enriched with whatever ingredients were on hand: dried fish, root vegetables, or milk from goats or cows. When resources were scarce, it was still filling and digestible, providing essential carbohydrates that powered Viking muscles. On raiding missions, dried oatcakes could travel long distances, giving warriors a portable, sustaining meal that didn't spoil a crucial advantage when crossing stormy seas or hostile territories. Barley and oats also held social and cultural significance. Ale made from barley was central to feasts, rituals, and religious ceremonies, fostering camaraderie and loyalty. Porridges and breads were shared among families, and grain stores determined a village's ability to survive harsh winters. In times of scarcity, the careful management of barley and oats could mean the difference between life and death. Even today, archaeological evidence of granaries and storage pits underscores the grain's importance in Viking society. Despite their humble appearance, these grains carried immense power. They sustained raiders on long voyages, fed communities through famine, and were a key reason the Vikings could survive in such a hostile environment. Their simplicity disguised their importance. A humble oatcake could fuel a warrior's rowing from Norway to England, while a steaming barley porridge could restore strength after a day of chopping wood, tending animals, or fighting in the fields. In short, barley and oats were far more than cheap meals. They were the foundation of Viking life, providing nutrition, endurance, and even social cohesion. They powered exploration, sustained the hungry, and ensured that no matter how brutal the northern winters or how fierce the raids, the Vikings could survive and thrive. Without these grains, the legends of longships, fearless warriors, and relentless raids would have faded, starved out by hunger long before reaching history. For Vikings, the ocean was both highway and pantry, and dried fish was the ultimate survival food. The harsh northern seas provided plenty of fish, from herring to cod, but fresh fish spoiled quickly. Vikings needed a method to preserve this vital protein, and drying was the answer. Strung on lines, hung from rafters, or laid on wooden racks in the crisp, salty wind, fish dried slowly under the sun and sea air. The process removed moisture, preventing bacterial growth, while intensifying flavour and making the fish lightweight and portable. Dried fish wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. Aboard longships, there was no room for fresh provisions or refrigeration. Warriors and sailors relied on hard, salty strips of cod, herring, or even eel to keep hunger at bay during months at sea. A single dried fish could be rehydrated over a small fire or gnawed on raw if no cooking facilities existed. Its high protein content fueled muscles for rowing, hauling sails, and fighting, while the natural salt preserved electrolytes lost during exertion. Vikings understood the value of practicality. Food had to survive storms, exposure, and time. The process of preparing dried fish was as important as its consumption. Vikings gutted and cleaned each catch meticulously, ensuring only the firmest cuts were preserved. Some fish were split open and salted before drying, a primitive brine that enhanced taste and longevity. Others were smoked over open fires, adding flavour while further protecting against spoilage. Salted or smoked, dried fish became an essential part of every Viking household, a staple that transcended social class. Rich or poor, inland or coastal, everyone depended on it. It wasn't gourmet, but it was life-saving. Dried fish also played a strategic role in Viking raids and exploration. When setting out for foreign shores, raiders packed stores of dried herring and cod to last weeks or even months. These hardy strips of protein allowed raiders to travel farther and fight longer without relying on uncertain local supplies. Even during winter campaigns, when fresh food was scarce and hunting yielded little, dried fish kept armies moving, their bodies fueled by centuries of culinary wisdom. Culturally, dried fish symbolized Viking ingenuity and resilience. It reflected their intimate knowledge of nature, the sea, and the seasons. The simple act of preserving food connected communities, ensured survival, and enabled adventures that would become legendary. From the family hearth to the prow of a longship, dried fish bridged domestic life and epic exploits. Without it, the iconic voyages to England, Ireland, and beyond might have faltered, undone by hunger and exhaustion. In short, dried fish was more than sustenance. It was survival, strategy, and symbol. Every chewy strip told a story of resourcefulness and endurance, of people who turned harsh landscapes into opportunities. It was a testament to the Vikings' ability to conquer not only distant lands, but also the unforgiving demands of nature itself. To bite into a piece of dried fish was to taste the very essence of Viking life. Salty, tough, and unyielding, yet sustaining enough to power legends. For Vikings, meat wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. Hunting, herding, and raiding provided bountiful sources of protein, but preserving it posed a constant challenge. The northern climate and long winters meant fresh meat would spoil in days. Vikings turned to smoking, a method that transformed perishable cuts into long-lasting, flavorful staples. Smoked meat became the backbone of their diet, sustaining warriors on long voyages and families through harsh winters. The smoking process was both art and necessity. Vikings would hang cuts of pork, beef, or game above slow-burning fires in smokehouses or even within longhouses, where thick smoke infused the meat while drying it. The aromatic smoke did more than flavour the meat it killed. Bacteria reduced moisture and created a durable, portable source of nourishment. Some cuts were salted first, combining preservation techniques that maximised longevity. The result was jerky-like strips of meat, tough yet rich with flavour, that could last for months without refrigeration. Smoked meat wasn't only practical, it was versatile. At home, families could boil or roast it to add warmth and substance to soups and stews. On the road or at sea, warriors gnawed on the jerky raw, drawing strength from the concentrated protein. The high energy content kept Vikings rowing, hauling sails, and swinging swords during raids. Unlike fresh meat, which spoiled rapidly, smoked meat could endure the unpredictable delays of long journeys or extended winters, making it a critical component of Viking resilience. Culturally, smoked meat carried social significance. During feasts and celebrations, the aroma of smoked cuts hanging over open fires filled halls with anticipation. Even in times of scarcity, smoked meat represented resourcefulness and self-reliance. Wealthier families might pair it with grains, vegetables, or herbs, while commoners relied on plain smoked cuts as a hearty staple. The skill of smoking meat was passed down through generations, reflecting a deep understanding of preservation, flavour, and survival in a harsh world. Smoked meat also played a strategic role in Viking expeditions. Raiders and explorers packed it carefully for long voyages across stormy seas. Unlike other foods, smoked meat could withstand the motion of ships, the unpredictability of weather, and the limited cooking options at sea. It enabled Vikings to extend their reach farther than most societies of the era, fueling legendary raids across England, Ireland, and beyond. Every strip of jerky became both a ration and a symbol of endurance, a lifeline when other provisions were uncertain. In essence, smoked meat exemplified the Viking balance of practicality and skill. It was more than food. It was fuel for survival, for conquest, and for community. Tough, smoky, and sustaining, it connected Vikings to the land, the hunt, and each other. Each bite echoed centuries of adaptation, ingenuity, and unyielding determination, proving that even in the harshest conditions, Vikings thrived where others would perish. Long before modern energy bars and protein shakes, Vikings relied on a humble but vital dish, porridge. Far from a bland breakfast, this simple concoction of grains was the heartbeat of Viking sustenance, fueling warriors, farmers, and sailors alike. Barley, oats, and rye, the staples of their fields, formed the foundation, each grain packed with carbohydrates, fibre, and enough energy to sustain long hours of rowing, raiding, and labour. Viking porridge was far more versatile than one might imagine. It could be thin and soupy, served for quick consumption, or thickened into a dense, stick-to-your-ribs meal for those needing maximum endurance. Families added whatever they could find: milk from cows or goats, a dollop of honey for sweetness, dried fruits for bursts of flavour, or bits of smoked meat for protein. Sometimes it was stirred with seaweed or herbs, reflecting the coastal resources they scavenged during their travels. Every household had its own variations, a culinary signature passed from parent to child, perfected over years of trial, error, and survival instincts. For Viking warriors, porridge was more than mere sustenance, it was strategic. On long sea voyages, or just before a raid, a bowl of thick, hearty porridge provided energy that lasted for hours, keeping rowers steady and fighters alert. Unlike fresh meat or fish, porridge could be made with minimal fuel, cooked in large cauldrons, and eaten hot or cold. This practicality allowed Viking communities to stockpile grains for winter months, ensuring no warrior went hungry even when the snows trapped villages and blocked hunting paths. The cultural significance of porridge extended beyond the battlefield. In domestic life, it was a communal dish, served in bowls large enough for family members to dip their spoons and share warmth and nourishment. It was comfort food, an essential part of everyday life, bridging social classes from peasants to chieftains. Even during festivals, porridge appeared alongside roasted meats and sweetened cakes, a testament to its role as the backbone of the Viking diet. Its simplicity belied its importance. Every bite was survival, every spoonful a link to the land and the seasons that shaped Viking existence. Porridge also played a crucial role in adaptability and exploration. Vikings carried dried grains and oatmeal cakes on long expeditions, knowing they could rehydrate them with water or milk when supplies ran low. This portability meant that even in foreign lands or during months at sea, they had a reliable source of energy to maintain strength, endurance, and morale. When combined with smoked meats or foraged fruits, it became a meal capable of sustaining them through days of rowing, combat, and labour. In essence, Viking porridge was a perfect marriage of simplicity, nutrition, and survival strategy. It fueled the engines of conquest, built resilience in harsh climates, and connected communities across homes and longships. Each bowl was a testament to Viking ingenuity, turning humble grains into the sustenance that allowed a fierce and unstoppable people to thrive where others might falter. It was comfort, it was fuel, and above all, it was survival in the truest sense of the word. The harsh northern seas of Viking lands were both a source of life and a test of endurance. Fish were abundant, but fresh catches spoiled quickly in the cold and unpredictable climates. The Vikings solved this problem with a simple yet ingenious solution: drying. Strung on racks or hung in the wind, fish like cod, herring, and salmon became a portable, long-lasting source of protein that could sustain warriors, farmers, and sailors alike. Dried fish was more than just food, it was a survival tool. Vikings could carry it on long sea voyages or store it through harsh winters without fear of spoilage. When rehydrated or eaten as is, it provided essential nutrients, particularly protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and minerals, keeping muscles strong and minds sharp for rowing, hunting, and raiding. For longship crews, this meant strength that lasted days at a time, even when other supplies ran thin. Warriors knew that a handful of dried fish could mean the difference between exhaustion and readiness in battle. Preparation required patience and skill. After cleaning and splitting, the fish were carefully dried in the cold northern air or over smoky fires. The cold, dry wind acted as a natural preservative, while smoke added flavour and further protection against decay. Each step was critical. Too much sun could make the fish brittle, while too little drying could lead to mould. Families and communities had perfected the method over generations, turning a simple resource into a reliable staple that shaped Viking diets and expeditions. Dried fish also reflected the Vikings' connection to the natural world. Coastal communities depended on tides, seasons, and migration patterns to plan their harvests. During winter, dried fish became indispensable, complementing stored grains and preserved vegetables. Inland villages traded for it, understanding its value not just as nourishment, but as a commodity that could be exchanged for other essentials. The portability and long shelf life made it a prized resource, enabling Vikings to venture far from home with confidence that their survival needs were met. On long journeys or in the heat of battle, Vikings often ate dried fish raw, chewed for a quick energy boost, or soaked it in water or broth to make it softer and more filling. Its intense, salty flavour reminded them of the ocean, reinforcing their bond with the waters they sailed and the lands they conquered. Each bite was a connection to their environment, a testament to the resourcefulness and resilience that defined Viking life. Ultimately, dried fish was more than just a meal. It was a symbol of survival, adaptability, and ingenuity. It powered raids, fueled explorations, and sustained families through the harshest seasons. In a world where resources were limited and winters unforgiving, dried fish was a lifeline, providing sustenance that carried Vikings through both mundane chores and epic feats of endurance. For anyone unfamiliar with the toughness of Viking life, the simple dried fish revealed the true grit required to thrive in a land of ice, wind, and endless challenge. Beneath the frozen soils of Scandinavia, the Vikings found an unassuming treasure: root vegetables. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets may have seemed humble compared to the gleaming swords and ornate longships that defined Viking culture, but these underground crops were the backbone of survival. In a land where winters could stretch for half the year, root vegetables provided essential calories, vitamins, and minerals, keeping the population nourished when hunting was scarce and the seas were frozen. The process of growing and harvesting root vegetables was itself a challenge. Viking farmers had to carefully till the rocky northern soils, often using simple iron spades and wooden tools. Timing was critical. Plant too early, and frost could destroy the crop, plant too late, and the soil could harden, making the roots impossible to harvest. Once pulled from the ground, these vegetables were stored in cool, dark cellars or buried in sand to preserve them for months. Their long shelf life made them indispensable during winter, when other food sources dwindled and the risk of starvation loomed. Root vegetables weren't just survival food. They were versatile, fueling creativity in the Viking diet. They could be roasted over open flames, boiled in stews, or mashed with grains and herbs. Vikings often combined them with dried fish or salted meats, creating hearty meals that sustained warriors, farmers, and sailors alike. For young children and the elderly, root vegetables were a gentle but nourishing food, providing energy without overtaxing the digestive system. In every household, they represented reliability, a dependable source of nourishment regardless of the hardships outside. These humble crops also carried symbolic weight. In a society that revered strength and endurance, root vegetables reminded the Vikings of the value of patience, planning, and connection to the earth. Every carrot pulled or turnip stored was a quiet testament to their ingenuity, the ability to turn the harsh northern soil into a source of life. Traders and neighbouring tribes recognized the importance of these vegetables as well, often exchanging surplus roots for other essentials like grains, honey, or salt. On long journeys, Vikings often carried dried or boiled roots to complement their salted fish and preserved meats. Easy to store and resistant to spoilage, root vegetables could sustain them across icy fjords and stormy seas, keeping crews nourished for days or even weeks at a time. Their earthy flavours reminded the travellers of home, grounding them even as they ventured into unknown territories and engaged in raids far from familiar lands. Ultimately, root vegetables were the unsung heroes of the Viking diet. They represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the deep knowledge of the land that allowed Viking society to thrive despite brutal winters and unpredictable seasons. In a world dominated by warriors and raiders, it was these simple, unassuming crops that truly kept communities alive, proving that sometimes survival depended not on swords and shields, but on the quiet strength hidden beneath the soil. In the heart of every Viking home, from modest farmsteads to bustling longhouses, there was one constant: the simmering pot of porridge. Far more than a simple breakfast, porridge was the lifeblood of Viking survival, a thick, warming staple that provided the energy needed for the grueling demands of northern life. Made primarily from barley, oats, or rye, this humble dish was transformed with water, milk, or sometimes even beer, creating a dense, sustaining meal that could fuel a warrior or farmer from dawn until dusk. The preparation of porridge was a ritual in itself. Vikings would grind their grains with stone mills, a labour-intensive process that required strength and precision. Once ground, the grains were boiled in cast iron or clay pots over open hearths, occasionally sweetened with wild honey or flavoured with herbs for taste. For the ambitious, small amounts of dried berries or nuts could be stirred in, providing bursts of flavour and essential nutrients. Though it may sound plain to modern palates, this thick, creamy concoction was a powerhouse of sustenance, keeping bodies warm, strong, and resilient during the harsh Nordic winters. Porridge's importance extended far beyond the dinner table. It was a practical food for Vikings, on the move portable, calorie-dense, and easy to store. Farmers would prepare large batches and leave them to cool, making them easy to grab before a day of hard labour. Warriors and sailors heading out on raids or long voyages relied heavily on porridge as their primary source of energy. When supplemented with salted meat or dried fish, it became a complete meal capable of sustaining men through the long, unforgiving hours of rowing, fighting, or tending to the land. The cultural significance of porridge in Viking society was equally profound. It represented comfort, home, and community. In longhouses where generations gathered, a steaming bowl of porridge was a symbol of care, an assurance that no one would go hungry, even when the winter winds howled outside. Feasts often began with communal pots of porridge, a reminder that survival was a shared responsibility. The Vikings knew that strength did not come solely from swordsmanship, but from nourishing bodies and minds with reliable, sustaining food. Porridge also reflected the Vikings' ingenuity and adaptability. Even in times of scarcity, they could mix grains with whatever was available, water, milk, or even the broth from fish or meat to maintain energy levels. Its versatility made it a cornerstone of both everyday life and extraordinary journeys. Whether warming frostbitten hands by the hearth or fueling a crew navigating icy fjords, porridge was the quiet engine behind Viking endurance. In essence, porridge was the true daily fuel of Vikings, a dish that kept families alive, warriors strong, and explorers resilient. Beneath its simple appearance lay the story of survival, community, and unyielding endurance, a reminder that sometimes the most basic meals are the most powerful tools of life. In a world without refrigeration, the Vikings mastered the art of preserving food, ensuring that protein-rich meats could last through long winters, treacherous voyages, and extended raids. From salted pork to smoked fish, preserved meats were not just a convenience, they were a lifeline. For a Viking warrior preparing for a journey or a farmer bracing for the unforgiving northern winter, these durable foods provided the energy and strength necessary to survive. Salting meat was perhaps the most common method. Vikings would carefully rub salt into cuts of pork, beef, or game, drawing out moisture and creating an environment hostile to bacteria. Once cured, the meat could be stored for weeks or even months in cool, dry areas of the longhouse. This simple yet effective technique allowed families to maintain a steady supply of protein without relying on the unpredictability of hunting or fresh slaughter. Salted meat became the backbone of many meals, often simmered with grains, turned into hearty stews, or simply eaten in small slices during the day to stave off hunger. Smoking was another vital preservation method, particularly for fish and smaller cuts of meat. Vikings would build smokehouses or use designated areas of their longhouses, letting the slow burn of hardwood embers cure and flavour the meat. The resulting smoked fish, often cod or herring, was lightweight, portable, and packed with protein. On longships or during winter expeditions, smoked fish was the perfect sustenance, compact, easy to store, and high in calories. Vikings knew that maintaining their strength depended not only on the quantity of food, but also on its quality and durability. Dried meats, often called jerky in modern terms, were another staple. Thin slices of meat were carefully dried in the sun or near the fire until every trace of moisture disappeared. These strips of hardened meat could be carried on journeys, providing instant nourishment without the need for cooking. For Vikings marching across frozen fjords or raiding distant lands, dried meat was an indispensable survival tool, offering a concentrated source of energy in a compact form. Preserved meats also played a social and cultural role. Sharing a slab of smoked fish or a slice of salted pork could symbolize hospitality, respect, or solidarity within a clan. During feasts, even small portions of these meats were cherished, a reminder that the community could endure hardship together. Vikings understood that survival was as much about cooperation and resourcefulness as it was about strength and skill in battle. In essence, preserved meats were the portable powerhouses of Viking nutrition. They fueled warriors, sustained families, and enabled exploration across seas and frozen landscapes. Without these carefully stored proteins, Viking survival and their legendary raids would have been far less feasible. Salted, smoked, or dried, these meats were more than food. They were a strategy, a shield against hunger, and a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the Viking people. While salted pork, smoked fish, and dried meats provided essential protein, It was the humble root vegetables that often kept Viking families alive during the harshest winters. Potatoes weren't part of the Viking diet, but they relied on a variety of hardy roots, turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets that could withstand freezing temperatures and poor soil. These vegetables weren't glamorous, but they were indispensable, supplying crucial calories, vitamins, and minerals to fuel everyday life and sustain warriors. In the cold, dark months, when hunting was limited and the seas were frozen, Vikings turned to these roots as a dietary cornerstone. Harvested in late autumn, root vegetables were stored in pits or cellars, sometimes packed in sand or straw to prevent frost damage. This simple storage method allowed families to preserve a steady supply of food through the winter months, ensuring that even when meat was scarce, hunger could be staved off with a hearty stew of root vegetables and grains. Root vegetables were versatile. They could be roasted over an open flame, boiled into soups and stews, or mashed into thick, warming pastes. Sometimes they were combined with preserved meats or legumes to create one-pot meals that delivered a balance of protein, fibre, and carbohydrates. A single stew could provide enough energy for a day of rowing a longship, chopping wood, or practicing swordplay, illustrating how integral these vegetables were to both daily survival and the demands of Viking warfare. Beyond nutrition, root vegetables represented resilience and preparation. They were low-maintenance crops, resistant to the unpredictable climate of Scandinavia, and could be relied upon when other food sources failed. Viking farmers treated their root crops as an insurance policy against famine. Families often planned entire planting cycles around ensuring a successful root vegetable harvest, recognizing that survival depended on having these hidden sources of strength tucked away for lean times. Root vegetables also had a cultural and communal role. During feasts or seasonal gatherings, they were often cooked in large pots to feed extended families or visiting warriors. While they lacked the drama of a freshly caught fish or roasted boar, these vegetables symbolized stability, endurance, and resourcefulness. Sharing a bowl of steaming root stew was a quiet celebration of survival, a recognition of the harsh northern world in which Vikings thrived. In the end, root vegetables were more than just a backup plan, they were a lifeline. Their durability, nutritional value, and adaptability made them a cornerstone of the Viking diet. Without them, the iconic Viking longhouses would have been silent in winter, and their legendary voyages far less feasible. The strength of a Viking was measured not only in battle prowess, but in the clever use of every edible resource at hand, and in that sense, the modest root vegetable was a silent hero of survival, carrying the Viking people through frozen landscapes and into history. When we imagine Viking feasts, we often picture roasted meats, mead flowing in horns, and long tables crowded with warriors. But the truth is, most Viking families didn't live their lives in constant celebration. For the majority of the population, farmers, thralls, and struggling villagers' food was a daily battle for survival. And in that battle, one of the humblest yet most essential meals was gruel. Gruel was not glamorous. It was not a dish meant to impress guests or celebrate victories. Instead, it was the meal that kept poor families alive when resources ran thin. At its simplest, gruel was made by boiling barley, oats, or rye in water until it thickened into a porridge-like consistency. Unlike the richer meals of the wealthy, gruel rarely had milk, honey, or meat added to it. It was bland, heavy, and repetitive. Yet it filled stomachs when nothing else could. Barley was the most common base for Viking gruel because it was hardy and easy to grow in the northern climate. Unlike wheat, which was more valuable and less reliable in the cold, barley thrived even in poor soil. Farmers would grind or crush the grains, then boil them in large iron pots over the hearth. When times were especially difficult, families would stretch the mixture by adding more water than grain, creating a thin, soupy porridge that that gave the illusion of a full meal. Sometimes, small additions could make the gruel slightly more bearable. A pinch of salt, a few wild herbs, or even leftover scraps of vegetables might be tossed into the pot. On rare lucky days, if milk was available, it could be stirred in to make the dish creamier. But for many, especially during long winters when food stores were nearly gone, gruel was plain, tasteless, and repetitive. Children grew up on gruel. Thralls, the enslaved labourers of Viking society, were fed gruel as their main meal, giving them just enough energy to keep working. Even farmers and their families relied on it when they had little else. It was not a food of celebration, but of survival, a dish that reflected the harsh reality of Viking life. For travellers and warriors, gruel also played its part. While dried meat and fish were carried on journeys, when they stopped in villages or returned home from raids, gruel was often waiting. It may not have tasted like victory, but it restored strength after exhaustion. In many ways, gruel symbolized the Viking spirit of endurance. It was not glorious, but it was reliable. It was the meal that required no grand ingredients, no elaborate preparation, just a pot, some grain, and enough fire to boil water. In a land where the cold could kill and the soil gave only what it could, gruel was the simplest weapon against hunger. The Viking Age was not built on feasts alone. It was built on the strength of ordinary people who endured hardship with humble meals like gruel. For them, survival came one bowl at a time. The Vikings were masters of the sea, and their diet reflected it. While farming and hunting provided some food, it was fish that truly sustained communities for much of the year. Yet fresh fish spoiled quickly, especially in the days before refrigeration. To survive, Viking people developed methods to preserve their catches, creating meals that were cheap, long-lasting, and reliable. Among these, dried fish and salted herring became lifelines for both households and warriors at sea. Fishing was a daily activity for many coastal villages and inland communities near rivers and lakes. Nets, hooks, and traps were crafted from bone, wood, and later iron, allowing families to bring in cod, herring, and salmon. But the true challenge wasn't catching the fish, it was making sure it lasted through long winters and long voyages. Drying was the simplest solution. Fresh fish were split open, cleaned, and then hung in the cold northern air or near smoky fires. Over days, the flesh hardened into tough strips, losing its moisture but gaining durability. Dried fish could last for months without spoiling. For many Viking families, it was the cheapest way to ensure food supplies would not run out when the seas froze and boats could no longer sail. Herring, in particular, became one of the most common preserved fish. Salted herring was prepared by layering fish with coarse salt, which drew out moisture and prevented decay. This salty, pungent food could be eaten directly, though most preferred to soak or cook it to soften the flesh. The taste was strong, often overwhelming, but it provided vital protein and calories. For poor households, dried fish was a daily staple. Children chewed on tough strips like jerky, while adults crumbled it into stews or boiled it with grains to soften it. It was not a meal of comfort, but of necessity. For warriors, it was even more important. On long voyages across the North Sea, where farming was impossible and hunting uncertain, barrels of salted herring and bundles of dried cod kept crews alive. Without these preserved foods, Viking raiding expeditions would never have reached distant shores. The texture of dried fish was notoriously difficult, chewy, leathery, and sometimes so tough that knives were used to cut it into bite-sized pieces. Yet to the Vikings, this was a small price to pay for survival. Eating dried fish was not about pleasure, it was about strength and endurance. Even when all else failed, dried fish rarely did. Salted herring also carried an economic importance. In later centuries, it would fuel trade across Europe, but even in the Viking Age, villages that produced good stores of preserved fish could exchange them for tools, cloth, or livestock. For some, it was not only food, but currency. Dried fish and salted herring may not sound like a feast to us today, but for Viking families, they were proof of human ingenuity. In the face of harsh winters, long voyages, and uncertain harvests, these humble foods gave them something greater than flavour. They gave them survival. When we picture Viking bread, it is easy to imagine golden loaves fresh from an oven, but reality was far more humble. The majority of Viking people did not enjoy soft, fluffy bread like we know today. Instead, they relied on dense flatbreads and ash cakes, simple, cheap, and filling foods that were within reach of even the poorest households. These breads were not a luxury, but a survival tool, made from the grains that could withstand the harsh northern climate. Barley and rye were the backbone of Viking baking. Wheat was rare and expensive, often reserved for the wealthy, but barley grew in poor soil and short summers. Ground into coarse flour, it became the base for flatbreads. These were small, round, and heavy, often no thicker than a handspan. Instead of ovens uncommon in most homes, the breads were cooked on hot stones, iron griddles, or directly in the ashes of the fire. Ash cakes, as the name suggests, were dough patties pressed into the glowing coals or buried beneath ashes to bake. When pulled out, they were dusted off and eaten with whatever was available, sometimes butter or cheese, sometimes a scrap of dried fish, but often nothing at all. The smoky taste was unmistakable, and while modern mouths might find it strange to Viking families, it was the flavour of survival. Flatbreads were practical in every way. They required no yeast, no waiting, and little effort. A handful of flour, a splash of water, and a hot stone were enough. The dough was often rough, filled with husks and bits of grain, giving it a gritty texture. It was not soft or airy, but tough and dense, the kind of bread that could last days without spoiling. Some families baked stacks of flatbreads at once, storing them for travel or for the cold months when ovens and firewood were scarce. For the poor, bread often formed the bulk of the meal. A flatbread could be dipped in thin vegetable stews to soak up flavour, or crumbled into gruel to add substance. Children were given small ash cakes to chew on, and warriors packed flatbreads for journeys, since they travelled light and kept well. Even when nothing else was available, bread gave a sense of fullness, a shield against hunger. Yet even this humble food carried meaning. Flatbreads and ash cakes were not just about nourishment, they were symbols of the Viking household. The work of women who ground grain by hand on stone querns, who mixed dough by firelight, who fed their families with the most basic of ingredients. In these breads was the story of survival, of resilience, of making something out of nearly nothing. To the Vikings, bread was not a luxury or a delicacy, but a constant companion. It was eaten daily, in good times and bad, in feast halls and in the poorest farms. Flatbreads and ash cakes may not have been celebrated in sagas, but without them, Viking families would not have endured. These simple rounds of grain and fire carried them through the hunger of winters and the long nights of survival. Not every Viking meal was made of meat and fish. In truth, those were luxuries for many households. For the majority of farmers, thralls, and villagers, survival depended on simpler meals made from what they could pull from the earth. Among these, thin vegetable stews became one of the most common and cheap foods in Viking life. They were warm, filling, and easy to stretch when supplies were low, which made them the perfect dish for families who had little to spare. The Viking world was not blessed with endless fertile soil. Harsh winters, short growing seasons, and poor farmland meant that only hardy crops could survive. Vegetables, like turnips, cabbages, leeks, onions, and carrots, grew in their gardens and fields. These were not sweet or tender varieties like the ones we enjoy today, but tougher, earthier plants that could endure cold and rocky ground. When harvested, they were often stored in pits or cellars. where they could last through the winter months. Stews were born out of necessity. Families would chop up whatever vegetables they had, turnips, leeks, wild herbs, even nettles, and boil them in large iron pots over the hearth. The result was often a watery broth with chunks of vegetables floating within. If luck allowed, a scrap of meat, a marrow bone, or a piece of fat might be added to give it more flavour. But more often than not, the pot was filled with little more than vegetables, herbs, and water. For the poor, these stews were eaten day after day, sometimes with flatbread or ash cakes on the side. They might taste bland, but they offered warmth, hydration, and enough nourishment to keep a family alive. Mothers fed thin stew to their children, adding wild greens from the forest when gardens ran empty. Warriors returning home from raids sometimes found no feasts waiting, only a pot of vegetable broth simmering over the fire. What made stews so valuable was their flexibility. One pot could feed an entire family, and if another guest arrived, more water could always be added to stretch the meal further. It was a dish of sharing, of making do, and of resilience. Even thralls, who ate the simplest and cheapest foods, were often fed stews, since a single pot could serve many without costing much. The flavours changed with the seasons. In summer, fresh greens and herbs made the stews brighter. In winter, stored roots like turnips and cabbages dominated the pot. Sometimes dried peas or beans were added, giving the dish a little more weight. But no matter what went inside, the thin vegetable stew was a reminder of how Viking families endured the unforgiving climate. These humble broths were not sung about in sagas, yet they were the quiet heroes of daily survival. Thin vegetable stews gave warmth during the freezing nights, filled stomachs when stores were low, and proved that even the simplest plants could sustain life. For the Viking people, the true measure of a meal was not taste or luxury, it was whether it could carry them through another day. When the fields offered little and the stores of grain ran low, Viking families turned to the wild. The forests, meadows, and coastlines of the north were more than just landscapes. They were pantries of survival. Foraged foods played a crucial role in the Viking diet, especially for the poor who could not afford constant supplies of meat or imported goods. Berries, nuts, roots, and mushrooms gathered from the land became lifelines, turning nature itself into a silent provider. Children were often the first foragers. Sent into the woods and fields, they collected hazelnuts, lingonberries, bilberries, and raspberries in woven baskets. These small hands learned early which berries were safe and which were dangerous, for a single mistake could be fatal. In summer and early autumn, the abundance of wild fruits provided sweetness that was rare in the Viking diet. Berries were eaten fresh or dried in the sun for storage, later mixed into porridge or bread to add flavour during the winter months. Nuts were equally valuable. Hazelnuts grew in abundance, and families would gather as many as possible before the first frost. They could be stored for months, eaten raw, or crushed into flour for baking. Nuts offered a source of fat and protein that was otherwise scarce in poorer households. Along with acorns and chestnuts in certain regions, they represented free food that nature provided without the need for ploughs or fields. Roots and wild plants also played their part. Vikings dug up wild onions, carrots, and parsnips, as well as edible roots like burdock. Stinging nettles, though harsh to touch, were cooked down into soups and stews, offering both nourishment and medicine. Mushrooms, though risky, were gathered carefully. Those who knew the difference between safe and deadly varieties could add them to meals for extra flavour and sustenance. Foraging was not just a supplement to farming, it was a survival strategy. In hard winters, when livestock had been slaughtered and stores of grain were almost gone, families scoured the land for anything edible. Seaweed was collected along the coast, dried and eaten, while inland, wild herbs like sorrel and dill were added to thin stews. Even tree bark, such as from birch or pine, was sometimes ground into meal to stretch flour supplies during famine. Thralls and poorer households relied on foraging more than anyone. While wealthier families might trade for imported luxuries, the poor survived by knowing the land intimately. A child who could recognize a safe mushroom, a mother who could turn nettles into soup, or a father who knew where to find hazelnut groves could make the difference between life and starvation. Foraged foods carried more than just calories, they carried resilience. They were a reminder that the Viking people were not just warriors and sailors, but survivors who worked with the land as much as against it. To step into the forest was to step into a storehouse of hidden riches, gifts, waiting for those who knew where to look. In the end, these wild foods may have been humble, but they were treasures of survival. For many Viking families, the forest was not only a place of mystery and danger, it was the kitchen that never closed. When we think of Vikings today, it is easy to picture roaring feasts, meat piled high, horns filled with mead, and laughter echoing through smoky halls. But that image tells only half the story. For most Viking men, women, and children, food was not about celebration, it was about survival. Their daily meals were rarely lavish. Instead, they were built from what was cheap, available, and reliable. The truth of Viking life was that hunger was never far away. Harsh winters, failed harvests, storms at sea, and raids that destroyed farmland could leave entire communities on the edge of famine. In such times, food was measured not by its taste, but by its ability to keep a body alive for another day. Meals were not designed for luxury, but for endurance. Gruel boiled from barley, flatbreads baked in ashes, dried fish tough as leather, thin vegetable stews, and handfuls of foraged berries. These were the daily meals of the people. Meat was eaten when livestock were slaughtered, or when hunting succeeded, but it was not a constant presence on the table. Instead, the Viking diet was built around grains, vegetables, and preserved foods. Cheap meals like these did not bring joy or pride, but they brought strength, and that was what mattered most. Still, even in this struggle for survival, there was meaning. A steaming pot of thin stew on a freezing night offered warmth as much as nourishment. A flatbread shared among a family reminded them of unity. Dried fish on a voyage across stormy seas gave warriors the strength to row, fight, and return home. Even the humblest of foods carried with them the weight of survival, and with it, the story of the Viking people. Luxury did exist, of course, but it was rare. Wealthy jarls and successful raiders could enjoy imported spices, honey, and fresh meats, but these were fleeting moments of abundance in a world that was otherwise unforgiving. For the majority, every meal was tied to the rhythm of the land, the sea, and the seasons. A poor harvest meant leaner stews, a bountiful fishing season meant fuller tables. Life was a constant balance between plenty and scarcity. It is in these humble foods that the resilience of the Viking people is revealed. They did not simply survive because of strength in battle or skill at sea. They survived because they knew how to endure hunger, how to stretch every grain, and how to find food where others might see nothing. Their strength came not only from their swords, but from their ability to live on the simplest of meals without breaking. So, when we remember the Vikings, we should not only think of their grand feasts or bloody raids. We should also think of the bowl of gruel, the piece of flatbread, the strip of dried fish, and the handful of wild berries, for these were the true meals that kept them alive. Meals of survival, not luxury. Meals that carried a people through the cold, the hunger, and the centuries.